Chapter 10. Pat Stevens hesitated briefly after walking out from Sally to his saddled horse. The grey had been ridden to Dutch Springs and back, and Pat decided it'd be a good idea to change him for a fresher horse. He didn't know far how he'd be riding, nor how fast. His plans were vague, but he knew he likely wouldn't be back to the lazy mare before matters had been settled with Eustace Arlo. Instead of mounting the grey, he picked up the trailing reins and led him to the corral. He pulled saddle and sweaty blanket off and dumped them on the ground and unbarred the gate and swung it open, and then slipped the bridle off the grey's head. The horse snorted gleefully and trotted towards the other saddle horses bunched in one corner of the pen, watching the man curiously. Pat stepped back and unhooked his coiled lariat from its leather thong about the saddle horn, and then entered the corral and closed the gate behind him. He shook out a small loop as he walked toward the horses in the corral corner, and let it trail along the ground behind him, while he held the rest of the coiled rope in his left hand. The horses tossed their heads and scattered at Pat's approach. They milled around and began to circle wildly around him as he stopped in the center of the corral. They pretended to be very wild and quite frightened, tossing their heads and snorting as they circled the corral at a gallop, but it was only a game they played each time a man entered the corral with a rope in his hand. As soon as a loop tightened about the neck of any one of them, that horse would instantly quiet down and become docile. Pat swiveled slowly, studying the circling horses in the moonlight with narrowed eyes while he waited for a short coupled dun to separate from the others so he'd be a fair target for Pat's throw. The dun was wily. He'd been roped out of the corral hundreds of times and knew all the tricks of the game. He pressed close at the heels of the horses in front of him, managing all the time to keep other horses' rump between his head and the man in the center of the corral. Pat had vast amounts of patience, and he knew the tricks of the game as well. He kept turning, always with the small loop spread out behind him, ready for an instant throw, with his eyes glued upon the dun. After a dozen circles around the corral, the horses began to tire of the fun. They slowed to a lope, and then some of them began to trot. Pat gave a sudden shout and made a feint towards the horse in front of the dun. He jumped forward, and for an instant the dun's head was clear, and Pat's loop sailed out and settled over his neck. The dun stopped instantly and mournfully began to walk towards his captor. The other horses abandoned their game and gathered in one corner pensively, watching Pat lead the dun out and saddle him. The dun bowed up in the middle and took a few springy jumps on stiff legs when Pat mounted, but Pat wasn't in a mood for further play, and he tightened the reins and rolled the horse lightly. The dun instantly relaxed and broke into a trot. Pat reined him down towards the bunkhouse. There wasn't any lights in the house where the lazy mare hands slept, but Pat thought Pete and the others might have returned from town and gone to bed before he come back. He pulled open the door and called Pete lightly. He waited a moment, got no response. His features tightened and he turned to ride away from the ranch alone. He had sort of a plan that would be easier accomplished with some help, but he'd have to go it alone. He knew there would be no telling when the boys would be back, and they might refuse to ride with him if he waited. They all liked EZRA and were probably pretty disgusted with their boss after what he had done in town. Pat led the fresh dun out into an easy lope and then headed due south across the range. His ranch stretched a dozen miles to the south from the headquarters, with 1/4 of it touching the Spangler ranch that EZRA had bought recently. From that corner, it was another 2 miles to the closest boundary fence of the XVX. It was well past midnight. Somewhere around about 1:30, Pat figured, after squinting up at the moon and stars. There was no particular trail leading in the direction he was heading, and Pat guided the dun straight towards the lazy mare's corner by instinct. Pat used up an hour covering that first 12 miles, holding his mount down to a steady pace that left plenty of strength in reserve for the riding that would be required after the lazy mare boundary was reached. When he was less than a mile from the corner, Pat slowed to a dog trot while he searched through the velvety moonlight for signs of the lazy mare cattle ahead. There was a little coulee near the corner that was rich in grass, and he thought he'd find a bunch bedded down there. And as he neared the coulee, he decided he had better drive a few of those along to the fence line and not take a chance at finding others closer. It would slow him up a little, but it would save time in the end if there wasn't any others closer and he had to ride back to the coulee. His hunch was right. There was 10 or 12 two-year-old heifers sleeping in the lush grass, and they checked and lifted their heads and stared at him in mild surprise when he checked his horse in front of them. They were well fed and tame, and he had some difficulty rousing them and cutting out half a dozen to drive towards the fence corner. They weren't used to being woken like this for a night drive and were reluctant to leave the rich pasturage in the coulee. But the den was an experienced cow horse. With his help, Pat got them moving forward ahead of him, only after a few minutes of delay. They trotted along slowly and refused to be bullied into increasing their speed, and it took them almost half an hour to make that last half mile to the corner. There was a gate in the wire fence in the corner, and Pat circled ahead just before they got there and rode his dun close to lean from the saddle and lift the wire loop holding the gate stave close to the post. He threw the gate open and loped back before the heifers had made up their minds to scatter, pushed them through the gate, and then closed it behind them, and then continued the drive in a straight line for the VX fence line 2 miles ahead. The stars were beginning to pale in the sky overhead, and the moon was sinking low towards the horizon when he reached his destination. He knew it must be nearly 3 o'clock, not long before day would begin to break in the east. There wasn't any gate in the VX fence when he hit it. Pat dismounted and got some wire cutters from his saddlebag and cut 3 strands of barbed wire without the slightest compunction. This was one of the worst crimes possible in the cattle country, but Pat had his own reasons for doing it. He drove the 6 fat heifers bearing his brand through the gap in the cut fence, and then shooed them on towards the VX headquarters. He stirred up other VX cattle along the way, and his heifers got intermingled with the small herd, and turned back after driving them more than a half mile from the gap. He galloped back and rode through it into EZRA's pasture just as their first red streaks were coloring the eastern sky. It was less than a mile to the slab house that EZRA had been fixing up to move into, and would almost be an hour yet before day would really come full light to allow the work Pat hoped to have gotten done. He knew EZRA had been laying in some supplies at the house and cooking his own midday meals there, so he turned his dun in that direction with the thought that he could boil up a pot of coffee at least while he waited for day to come. He left the cut wires of fence down behind him. The old Spangler house was set back on the edge of the draw underneath 4 aged cottonwood trees. It was built on untrimmed pine slabs chinked up with clay and moss. A decrepit windmill creaked lazily in front of the house, pumping a small stream of water that overflowed from the watering trough EZRA had recently repaired. Pat stopped his dun at the trough for a long drink, and then rode up to the side of the house and tied the reins to the cottonwood sapling. It was still quite dark, and he fumbled around to the back door and found it unlocked. He struck a match as he went into the kitchen and stood looking around for a lamp and a candle. A wooden box of groceries stood in the middle of the floor, and there was a coffee pot and frying pan on the old wood stove, but Pat didn't see anything to make a light with. As the match burned down to his fingers, he remembered that EZRA hadn't started staying here at night yet, so there wasn't any good reason why there would be a lamp in the house. He struck another lamp and went over to the stove, found a neat box of kindling with wadded up newspapers to start a fire with. He laid a fire in the darkness and put flames to it, and then hoisted the coffee pot from the back of the stove and grimaced when the weight told him it was still half full of stale coffee and used grounds. He had expected to find it that way, of course. That's the way EZRA kept house. He used a big pot and started out fresh once a week with a clean pot and a few handfuls of coffee in the bottom along with a few cups of water. Ezra didn't believe in wasting the grounds after each pot of coffee, and after drinking all he wanted, he'd set the pot back on the range. And next time he wanted coffee, he simply added a handful of coffee to the old grounds and poured in more water and brought her to a boil. He kept this up until the pot was so full of grounds that there wasn't any room for any more water, and then he'd dump it out and then start over. By the feel of the pot, Pat knew it held a collection of grounds that had accumulated for several days. He blundered across the dark kitchen to the door, went out and emptied the pot onto the ground, carried it around to the house, to the horse trough, where he rinsed it out and filled it about half full of fresh water from the trough. He grinned to himself as he thought what Sally would say if she could see him doing it. She had some fool notion that water from a horse trough wasn't sanitary enough for cooking in. Just as if boiling wouldn't kill all the germs, but all women were sort of finicky about such things. He carried the pot back to the stove, where his kindling box was beginning to roar, and set it on the heat, replenished the firebox with bigger pieces of wood. He stuck another match and rummaged around amongst the shelves until he found Ezra's coffee sack, and then poured a sufficient amount into the pot to make a brew strong enough to float an egg, and then found a broken-back chair and settled back comfortably against the wall to smoke a cigarette while he waited for the pot to boil. He wished that Ezra was with him. He hated to think about the big one-eyed hairy man being cooped up in jail. Ezra was funny about jails. He'd been locked up plenty of them in his time, but he certainly never got used to the idea. It sort of made him kind of smothery all feeling to be locked up, he said, and he got mighty restless after a few hours. Pat tried not to think about the way that Ezra had looked at him in the Gold Eagle when he turned him over to Triple. Like Ezra figured the end of the world had come. Like he'd lost his last friend in the world. More curious than angry, sort of like he pitied Pat instead of hating him. Still, even now, Pat didn't see how he could have done anything differently. There wasn't any doubt that Ezra was safer locked up in jail for a few days than anywhere else. If Sam and he would have just listened to reason in the back room of the Gold Eagle, Pat could have explained what he planned to do. But they were a couple of hotheads who thought they could whip the world with one gun and a pair of fists. After all the scraps Pat had got them out of, they still hadn't learned that sometimes more could be accomplished by guile than brute force. Well, he hoped he had fooled Harlow, as he had Sam and Ezra. All he needed right now was a little time. If he was lucky, as soon as it came daylight, he'd be able to locate the VX critters mingled in with Ezra's stuff and get them back into their own pasture before anyone saw him, and he'd have Ezra out of jail real quick. For Pat didn't have any doubt that there were some of VX cows in Ezra's herd, as Harlow claimed. Harlow was much too smart to make such an accusation without the proof to back him up. He would have had to seen it, that the cows were there, before he had Ezra arrested. Still, it was kind of a foolish charge to make against a man like Ezra. Everybody in the valley knew he wouldn't rustle a neighbor's stock. Harlow must know he couldn't hold him in jail very long on a trumped-up charge like that. It didn't make any good sense. Pat couldn't see why Harlow hoped to gain from it. That was bothering him all night. He didn't think Harlow was foolish enough to hope Ezra would ever be convicted, not even if a few of his cows were found in Ezra's possession. No jury of Powder Valley ranchers would ever believe Ezra was guilty. They would think the cows had strayed if they didn't go so far as to suspect that Harlow had put them in Ezra's pasture to frame them. Harlow must know that, Pat thought. He wasn't a fool. He knew Ezra's reputation for honesty in the valley. Then why in the hell had he gone to the farce of arresting Ezra? That question kept pounding at Pat, and he couldn't find any satisfactory answer to it. He didn't make the mistake of underestimating Eustace Harlow. He was pretty sure that wily Texan had some other trick up his sleeve, but for the life of him, Pat couldn't figure out what it might be. The coffee boiled over and splattered loudly on the hot stove, and Pat jumped up and hurried over to pull it back where it would simmer gently. He heard a horse coming up to the front of the house, and he stood still, listening with a deep frown on his face. It was almost dawn now. plenty light enough to distinguish objects outside the kitchen window. Pat heard the horse stop outside and heard a rider dismount. His own horse was tethered at the side of the house out of sight. He loosened his guns in their holsters and moved silently to the door leading from the kitchen. He stood there, waiting with his hands on the butts of his guns, listening to the slow, solid footsteps approaching the front door. The front door opened, and a bulky figure was outlined against the red glow of dawn in the sky. Pat saw the red whiskers and a single eye peering inside at him in the darkness, and he called out harshly, "Ezra, how'd you get out of jail, you dang fool?" His hands fell away from his guns as he spoke, and he took a long stride forward. A gun streaked out a lace of flame from him the doorway, and Pat felt an impact on his left shoulder as though a heavy club had struck him there. He twisted sideways and went down. He lay there cursing angrily. "Ezra, it's me, Pat. Don't you hear me? Don't you know?" The big whiskered man was striding towards him wordlessly. He bent over Pat and struck him a savage blow on the back of his head with the barrel of his 6-gun. Pat sank into a soft pit of blackness and didn't know any more. End of chapter 10.